Alrighty, sir. Thank you very much.
Excuse me.
I know, they need little slider pads on the chairs.
I'm going to put a little microphone on your lapel.
Okay.
And let's see, I got to make sure I get it going the right way here. Let's see, right here, I make sure. Is that your tummy? I think we just picked up your tummy growl.
Oh, I had a big lunch. I should have eaten so much.
Yeah, you can just put that underneath and,
Good deal.
okay, and whenever you're ready,
All right.
and you can start with
So-
the intro, the date and where we are.
Sure. All right, so today we are interviewing Mr. Theron Summers at Westminster Village. My name is Amanda Murphy, and I'm a Life Enrichment Coordinator at Westminster Village in Bloomington, Illinois. Today is August 10th of 2018, and Theron is one of our residents who lives here at Westminster. All right, so Theron, we'll just ask you a couple of questions here. Where and when were you born?
I was born in Edwards County, Illinois. Albion, Illinois is the county seat. It's about 185 miles south, a little east of Bloomington.
And what year were you born in?
In 1922.
Okay.
Born on the farm where my parents lived.
And what were their occupations, or
They were farmers.
Just farmers? Okay. And so, assumedly, you were a farmer before you went into the service.
Yes, I was. I was a student at Illinois, Charleston, Illinois, at Eastern Illinois State Teachers College at that time. I was a freshman there when Pearl Harbor came, and I was not old enough to have registered at that time. So I lost interest in college, and I wanted to come home, which I did in the spring. And my brother, who was 8.5 years older than I, only two of us in the family, and he helped my father on the farm. They were in partnership. He was still single at that time. And he was drafted in September before Pearl Harbor. So he ended up spending 5 years in the military, and all of it overseas except basic training. So my father was left with a pretty big farming operation and left alone. He wasn't in very good health, really. And I left school to come home and help him on the farm. And then the cry was, food will win the war and write the peace. And food production was very important. So I helped my father, and then I became old enough to register when I was 20. And then the draft board gave me 3 or 4 deferments in order to farm and produce food. And finally, I was ready to go. I wanted to go. Others were going, and I was one of the few left at home in the community that was of age to be in the military service, and I wanted to be there. So consequently, I was drafted, but I was ready to go. And so I left in January of 1945.
What was the kind of town feel towards men that were going into the service?
I'm sorry about your question.
So how did people react when people were going into the service? So was it kind of a patriotic feeling among everyone?
Yes, everybody was very supportive, and we had a very fine spirit and great patriotic support.
I figured when you said you were ready to go that you were ready to join in on the patriotism there. So what service of the branch was your brother in?
He was in the Army also. Well, Army Air Force.
Oh, okay. And he was stationed overseas where at?
Well, he was finally transferred to the Army Air Force military police, and they sent him to Ireland because we had a fighting base there. That's where our bombers did most of their bombing over Germany and France and that area. So he spent 5 years there.
Wow.
And he saw lots of planes leave that didn't return, of course. It had lots of friends that left and never returned. And so he could tell a lot of stories that weren't pleasant.
Did he share a lot of those stories with you?
Not many, some, but not many.
Is there any in particular that you'd like to share that he shared with you?
No, I don't recall any specifically right at the moment.
Okay. All right. And so what happened when you departed for the training camp, for boot camp? How did you go? Did you go on a train or did you fly?
Well, I went to Fort Sheridan. That's where I was drafted in, or sworn in. And I went from there by train to Little Rock, Arkansas, to Camp Robinson for basic training.
And how was basic training?
Oh, it was all right. There were things about it I didn't like, of course. It was in the wintertime. It was in January, and it was in the Ozark Mountain area. And the terrain there was very difficult to move in. Had lots of copperhead snakes, which are very poisonous, and had a few rattlers, but basically copperheads. We had lots of ice and rain and light snow in the winter, and so it wasn't pleasant, but I knew it was a job that had to be done, and I didn't complain about it. I decided I want to be the best soldier I could be. And I intend to go and do my job and come back alive.
Yeah, that's what you did, right?
Yeah.
Stuck your head to it. Would you call any of your instructors? Do you remember much about your sergeants or people that were in charge at boot camp?
I remember one or two in particular. We had a fellow named I can't recall it. We had one that I really liked. His name was Sergeant Ryerson, and he'd been in combat, and but he was a good cattleman, but he was very sympathetic with what we had to go through in basic training, and he treated us well. He expected a lot out of us, but he made good soldiers of us. But the other was kind of a smart aleck. And I look back on it, and I realize now he was doing it for our good, but none of us liked him.
How did you adapt to military life?
Okay. Parts of it I liked, I liked the camaraderie with the fellows that I got to know. I was about 3 years older than most of my compatriots, and there were six of us in a tent, or not a tent, but a cabin, and they sort of looked up to me because I was a little older, and I enjoyed being somewhat of a mentor to them. I didn't try to be, but it just naturally turned out to be that way, and so it was a pleasant experience most of the time. I did not like the Army, I didn't like it because it was for the purpose. See, nobody wins in a war, so I hate war. But war has its place, and when we do it in self-defense, when we do it for a real cause, I'm for it. I felt my duty was to be there, and so I didn't have any trouble acclimating.
In terms of the
excuse me.
In terms of the food and the social life, how was boot camp?
Oh, food wasn't too good, but that's all right. I could tolerate that.
Yeah.
We had plenty to eat. And interesting thing, I thought I was enjoying the beef. We had beef stew a lot. About the end of my basic training, I found out I was eating mutton. And we raised sheep on the farm, and I wasn't a mutton person at all. But at any rate, that was kind of a joke on me.
Do you eat mutton now?
No.
No, not knowingly. Good deal. All right. So then after basic training, where did you head off to?
I went to, well, interesting thing, I was in basic training about a month, and I had a call from home. The Red Cross got in touch with me, and my mother had a heart attack. So I was sent home on a 10-day furlough, excuse me, and then I went back and I lost my company I was training with because I'd lost 10 days of training, which is very vital. And I couldn't miss that. It was very crucial that you get all of it. And so I was transferred to another company that wasn't as far along. So consequently, I repeated about 30 days of that training that I already had, and then caught up to where I was and finished my basic training. Back to your original question on that, though, you said, where did I go? Then I came home on delay en route, or a furlough again, and it's called the delay en route. I had 10 days to come home, and that was before I was going to go be shipped overseas. So I went back and home, and then I got on a train and went to Fort Riley, Kansas, reported in there, and I spent, I don't know, a fair amount of time, 30 days or so there. Then I got on a troop train and spent 3 days on a troop train en route to Fort Ord, California. And there I was laid over for, I don't know, a week or two. And then I was transferred to Long Beach, California, where I shipped out.
And where did you ship out to?
I shipped out, well, they sent me, I didn't know. I knew I was going to be there to invade Japan. That was what we all thought we were going to be doing. And of course, I didn't get on a regular troop train. They were wanting to get GIs over to the Philippines and in that area to prepare to be assigned and to outfits and to get ready to go to Japan. And I was going to end up in Okinawa for the staging area, but they were so anxious to get GIs over there that they were getting us there on any kind of transportation they could. So consequently, I was among a party of 30 GIs. These were all Army recruits. And we were put on a maritime vessel. And if you don't know, a maritime vessel is a vessel that's, they travel without escort. They carry supplies from the U.S. base to different points of operation in the overseas. And it was loaded with tanks and artillery and ammo and stuff like that. 12,000 cases of beer. Which I'm a beer consumer, but it was on there. We didn't get any of it, of course, and I didn't want it, but that was an interesting thing in the whole of the ship. So we were 30 days getting to the Philippines. We ended up in the Manila Bay, but 5 days before we got to Manila Bay, they dropped the atomic bomb. And Japan surrendered. And that was a happy day on the ship, and quite a celebration. And then they didn't really know what to do with us, I guess. They were, you know, the ocean was literally full. We were traveling without escort, but once in a while we would see a ship in the distance, and there were lots of maritime vessels with GIs. They built 2 dog houses, we called them, on deck on this ship that I was on, and they put us in those, and we just slept on bunk beds, and they were hard. It was hot, you know, it got to 110, 15 degrees out there in the daytime, and we crossed the meridian, of course, or the equator, I should say. But we landed in Manila Bay, and we sat there 3 days to get our orders before they unloaded us. And then I was unloaded and went to a replacement depot at San Fernando, which is about 2 miles south of Clark Field, which was one of our biggest airports in the Pacific area. It was a very big Air Force base, and I was about 2 miles or 3 out of Manila, and so I stayed there for about a week, and then one night late, I was called out to get my duffel bag and all my belongings, and put me in a truck along with loaded full of GIs. They took me into Manila Bay and loaded us on a escort on a destroyer. No one, I guess it's a landing craft of some kind. Yeah. And we were supposed to go to Okinawa, and they discovered they had too many men on it and too many troops, and they were going to have to unload some of them in the morning, and then we were supposed to catch a boat out the next day or two. Well, I didn't have any place to sleep. I got in there about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I just bunked down underneath of a half track and on the deck of and it rained that night, and I remember I was drenched and the water ran under me, and I was pretty miserable, but that was all right. So along about daylight, they said, listen up, we're reading off the name of 100 men, and you'll be getting on trucks and going back to your replacement depot, and you'll be going out probably tomorrow or the next day on another boat, because this one's overloaded. And I did that, and that next night we had a big typhoon hit in the Pacific, and it hit that convoy that I would have been on. And I don't know what happened to my records, but they were on that. They went ahead to Okinawa. I went back to my base, and consequently my orders were lost, my records were lost, and I was without records, I was without pay, I was without any mail for 6 months. And so I stayed at that replacement depot for 33 days, and then they loaded about 200 or 300 of us up and shipped us up to the Lingayen Gulf. That was about 200 miles north, and we rode all night in the back of a truck, or trucks, and I was one of the back trucks, and we went through, there were about 20 truckloads of us, I guess, all together. I don't know how many we had all together. I had over 200, I'm sure, but I was one of the last. And in the Philippines, it rains about every 2 or 3 hours. Mm-hmm. And in the daytime, the sun pops out and it dries off. You never know it rained. But that night, it was doing the same thing. It was raining, and we'd go through, we were on dusty roads, of course, dirt roads, and you get that many trucks back and just a constant dust and open trucks. And literally and then we'd rain on us, and then it'd kind of wash the dirt off a little bit, and then the dust would settle on us. I could just take my finger and and rake off a big piece of mud off each cheek, get out of my eyes. Miserable trip. But I went to the Lingayen Gulf, and 30 days later, we joined a convoy and went to South Korea. And our job there was to repatriate the Japanese, which you may not know, but South Korea was overrun by the Japanese for 21 years. And they took them over preceding the war. And they used them for factories and places to make a lot of their war materials. And consequently, a lot of the very best minds of the Japanese scientists and engineers, those that weren't in the military, went to Japan as civilians and worked in those factories and shops. They became wealthy. And many of them did, not all of them, but many of them did. But our job, I was in the 6th Army, and the 7th Army got in about a week ahead of us. We were the first troops in there. And we were to gather up all of the, well, we were part of the military government. And the military government was kind of a forerunner of that great democracy they have in South Korea today. And I was interviewed to join the military government in some capacity, and I was kind of interested. It sounded interesting until they told me I'd have to re-enlist for 2 years, and I was wanting to get home. I left home with my wife pregnant, and our first child was born right after I left. And so she was over a year old before I got to see her. And of course, I didn't get any mail. I didn't know what was going on at home. So I wanted to get home. And I didn't enlist in the military government, but we were there for the processing those. And so we had companies stationed all over South Korea, and we would be stationed close to railroads. And then they took the seats out of the rail cars, and they would gather up those families, Japanese families, and they put them in those rail cars, and they just had standing room only. And they'd take those down to Fusan, where I was eventually shipped to. I was in an outpost for a while, and then they shipped me down to Fusan, and they would ship those Japanese families in there, and all those people were allowed to take back with them was what they could carry on their backs, and 1,600 yen. And the yen is let's see, I've not forgotten, 16 cents, I believe. But that's all they could take was 1,600. Well, they could take all they could carry. You can't imagine what they'd get on their back. They would build those racks, I call them, on their backpacks, and they would build them out of wood and I mean, they were monstrous. And consequently, they couldn't get near as many people on in a boxcar as they'd like to do because of that. And our job was to shake those people down, and we had some Korean women who would take all the women into a private area, and they'd have those women to strip down, and they would have their clothing on the inside showing full of Japanese money, Korean money. And they'd have to take that away from them. And that was sad. And on the dock, we had to everybody have to lay all their belongings out. And we'd have to go through it book by book, and they'd lay in between the pages of all those books. And we'd have to confiscate all of that. I had a pretty good job. Those docks were literally loaded with dirt and paper and trash, you know, after all those people had come through there. And so there were 18 Japanese soldiers that had been taken captive before they surrendered. And I don't know where they came from, Okinawa or Philippines or somewhere. And they were in a stockade. And every morning, I was assigned to go in. I had a six-shooter, I had a pistol and armed, and I would go in. Didn't need that. These guys were, you know, they were glad to have something to eat and a good place to sleep. But their job was to keep the place policed up, get all the trash picked up, and I was in charge of those men. And I had a good job because one of them was a colonel, and he could speak fluent English. So I communicated to them what I wanted done through his interpretation. And so I don't know why I'm telling you all this.
No, that's okay. No, it's very interesting.
But,
absolutely.
There were 7 ships that went across the straits to Japan, and they could make that round trip about every 72 hours. So we'd load that boat with the Japanese, and we'd send them over to Japan. We had troops that landed in Japan then, and they were gathering up the Koreans and sending them back home to their homeland. So when they came in, our job was to send them to their respective areas. I don't know what, I had nothing to do with the designation of where they would go. But that was happening every 72 hours. We had a boat in the dock all the time, but the rotation was about 72 hours. So that was kind of interesting, and they were deprived of what they had. Of course, they didn't have very much over there like the Japanese did. Mm-hmm. And they'd have bolts of silk, you know, expensive silk they were trying to take back, and we'd have to confiscate that. And, well, that's the story of what we were doing. And then later on, after we got that job done, that took probably about 3 or 4 months to get the Japanese gathered up and out of there. And then it was just a matter of getting the government, the military government operating, getting the Koreans ready to govern themselves. Of course, I left there in about a year and sent back home. But before that, I need to back up. When I was in college, I was majoring in physical education. I wanted to teach and coach. Mm-hmm. And that was on my records. When they finally caught up on my records, somebody read that aspect of it. And at that time, they were setting up an enormous recreation and sports and recreation program, because we had all these GIs over there and all branches of service, and they needed something to do. You know, the war was over, and they weren't ready to send us back because they didn't know what might develop in the area, I guess. And they slowly began to processing us, sending us back. But in the meantime, they set up what they call the Pacific Olympics. And we had lots of good athletes. We had professional athletes drafted, you know. And I played softball with some pro baseball players. And they're on the peninsula of South Korea. But they set up what they call special services. And special services was responsible for developing this athletic program for the Olympics, and they were going to have the finals of the Olympics, which they really did in the Hawaiian Islands. I was wanting to go there, but I didn't make it. At any rate, I was made a coach, a basketball coach. I coached a battalion basketball team. And later on, they decided they'd send me to Japan, to Okinawa, to what they called a A&R school. It was an athletic and recreation school. So for 3 weeks, they flew me over there, and I was there for 3 weeks. A wonderful time I spent there, best I had. I had great food. They had better food than we had in Korea. And I was coached and instructed, taught by professional baseball players, professional volleyball coaches that were from colleges, and football, and I was coached by I can't think of his name. He was a prize fighter, and his name's left me, but a big-time prize fighter. Had a technical knockout, was a national champion for just a few weeks, and then somebody defeated him. But this caliber of people were our coaches and instructors, and I got that for 3 weeks, and I got my certificate. They sent me back, and then I became a leader. I was a staff sergeant, and I was the only non-commissioned officer, and there's one commissioned officer, and you wouldn't know this person, but Lieutenant did you ever hear of Chris Schenkel? He was the ABC sportscaster, and he called football games. He interviewed the winners of the Kentucky Derby each year, and he had a tremendous. Also, he held the Olympics, so 2 or 3 different times. But he was my commissioned officer, and he and I were very good friends. And he died with cancer about 6 or 7 years ago. And I won't put this in the story, but very much of it. But I did get to talk to him a while before he died, and we got reacquainted. But during that time, you're going to ask me one of the questions, I guess, if I made any friends. And during that time, I was dismissed from my regular company, and I went to live in a private barracks quarters with so I was in charge of the PX over there, and he was from Kentucky, and his name is Eugene French, and he had a situation much like